I haven't seen my son in 3 years. He died on his 8th birthday when our house caught fire. So when I felt his small, cold hand shaking my shoulder at 4:47 a.m., whispering those exact words my late husband used to say every Sunday morning, I knew something was terribly, impossibly wrong. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that making that coffee and setting that table would reveal a truth so devastating, it would unravel everything I thought I knew about the night my family died. The autumn rain hammered against my bedroom window like desperate fingers seeking entry. I was deep in that particular kind of sleep that only comes after grief has exhausted you, dreamless, heavy, almost death-like in its completeness. The sleeping pills Dr. Morrison prescribed had finally started working after months of insomnia. Then came the touch. Small fingers, ice cold, gripping my shoulder with surprising strength. The kind of grip a child uses when they're frightened, when they need their parent to wake up right now. "Mom," the voice whispered, and my heart stopped, completely stopped, because I knew that voice. I had listened to recordings of it every night for 3 years, torturing myself with home videos, birthday messages, that last voicemail Z'd left me from his father's phone. "Mommy, we're making pancakes, and Daddy says you're sleeping in like a lazy bear. Mom, wake up, please." My eyes snapped open. The digital clock read 4:47 a.m., its red numbers casting an eerie glow across my bedroom. The room was freezing. Not just cold, but that bone-deep chill that seems to come from inside your very marrow. My breath formed clouds in the air. And there, beside my bed, was the silhouette of a child. I couldn't scream. My throat had closed completely. I could only stare as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, making out the familiar shape of my son, Ethan. He looked exactly as I remembered, sandy brown hair, perpetually messed up, his favorite dinosaur pajamas, those serious brown eyes that always made him seem older than his years. "Ethan," I whispered, and saying his name out loud after 3 years of silence felt like swallowing broken glass. "You need to make coffee, Mom, and set the table." His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reciting lines from a script. "They're coming for breakfast. You need to be ready." "Who's coming? Baby, what?" "Make some coffee and set the table," he repeated, with more urgency this time. "Please, Mom, you have to. Before sunrise. They only come before sunrise." I reached out to touch him, to prove he was real, to hold my baby boy who I buried 3 years ago. But my hand passed through empty air. The silhouette flickered like a projection, and when I blinked, he was gone. I sat bolt upright in bed, gasping, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. A dream. It had to be a dream, another nightmare brought on by the grief counseling sessions, by talking about the fire, by Dr. Morrison making me confront my trauma. But the room was still freezing, and there, on my nightstand, written in the condensation on my water glass, were 4 words in a child's handwriting. "Please, Mom, trust me." My hands were shaking as I threw off the covers. The logical part of my brain, the part that had been a science teacher for 15 years before the fire destroyed everything, screamed that this was impossible. Hallucination. Grief-induced psychosis. Side effects from the medication. But I had felt his hand. I had seen those words. And deep in my gut, in that primal place where mothers keep their connection to their children, something told me this was real. I grabbed my bathrobe and made my way downstairs, each step creaking in the silent house. This place had never felt like home after the fire. We'd lived in a different house then, the one that burned. After I got out of the hospital, I'd moved here, to this rental on the edge of town, somewhere with no memories to haunt me. Or so I'd thought. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it, dishes in the sink for my half-eaten dinner, mail scattered on the counter, the coffee maker clean and ready because I never used it anymore. Coffee had been Mark's thing. Mark, my husband, who died in the fire alongside Ethan, who I'd tried and failed to save. This is insane, I muttered to myself, but my hands were already reaching for the coffee grounds, pulling out the filters, filling the reservoir with water. I'm making coffee because my dead son's goose told me to. They'll lock me up. They should lock me up. But I didn't stop. The coffee maker gurgled to life, that familiar sound I hadn't heard in years filling the kitchen. The smell hit me next. Rich, dark, exactly the blend Mark used to buy from that little shop downtown. Except I didn't have any coffee in the house. I hadn't bought coffee since the funeral. I opened the cupboard where I'd been reaching automatically, and there it sat, a fresh bag of dark mountain roast, Mark's favorite, in a bag with a receipt dated yesterday. A receipt from a store that had gone out of business 2 years ago. My hands were full on trembling now, but I kept going, scooping the coffee, watching it brew. While it dripped, I moved to the dining room, a space I'd never used, preferring to eat standing at the kitchen counter when I bothered to eat at all. Set the table, I whispered to myself. How many places? As if in answer, I heard Ethan's voice, clear as day, though I was completely alone. 6, Mommy. Set it for 6. 6. Before the fire, there had been 3 of us, me, Mark, and Ethan. Who were the other 3? I pulled out the nice china I'd packed away, the set my mother had given us for our wedding. Plates I hadn't seen in years emerged from boxes I didn't remember storing. I set 6 places, working on autopilot, my mind racing through possibilities. Hallucination, breakdown, carbon monoxide poisoning, brain tumor, anything except what the evidence suggested. As I placed the 6th setting, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5 times. The rain had stopped. Through the kitchen window, I could see the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. And then I heard it. A knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that seemed to echo through the entire house. I froze, a coffee cup suspended in midair above the saucer. No one knew I lived here. I had no friends left. Grief had isolated me completely. No family nearby. My few colleagues from my old teaching job had stopped calling after the first year of unreturned messages. Another knock. More insistent. Mom, Ethan's voice, right behind me. I spun around, and there he was again. More solid this time. I could see details I'd missed before. The small scar on his chin from when he'd fallen off his bike. The freckle behind his left ear. You have to let them in. You have to hear what they have to say. Ethan, baby, I don't understand. The fire, Mom. His eyes met mine, and they were filled with something I'd never seen there before. Not fear exactly, but a desperate urgency. Everything you think you know about the fire is wrong. They're here to tell you the truth. But you have to let them in before sunrise, or the door closes forever. What door? What truth? The knocking came again, and this time voices accompanied it. Sarah, Sarah, please, we don't have much time. A man's voice. Familiar, impossible. It was Mark. My legs nearly gave out. I grabbed the edge of the table, knocking a fork to the floor with a clatter that seemed supernaturally loud. Please, baby, I know you're scared, but we need you to be brave. Like always. My mother who had died when I was 17. My mother's voice I'd almost forgotten until this very moment when it came flooding back with crystal clarity. I looked at Ethan. What is this? What's happening to me?
"The truth, Mummy, but only if you're brave enough to hear it." He started to fade, his form becoming translucent. "Let them in, please, before it's too late." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in a dining room set for 6, with coffee brewing and the impossible waiting at my door. The knocking came one more time. I walked to the front door like a woman in a trance. My hand reached for the knob. Every logical thought in my head screamed to call 911, to run, to do anything but open this door. But I had to know. I had to understand. I turned the knob and pulled the door open. 5 figures stood on my porch in the pre-dawn darkness, backlit by the street lamp across the street. As my eyes adjusted, I recognized each one, and with each recognition, my reality cracked a little more. Mark stood in front, looking exactly as he had the morning of the fire, wearing his favorite blue sweater, the one I'd buried him in, his reading glasses pushed up on his head. Next to him was my mother, Elizabeth, in her Sunday dress, the floral one she'd been buried in 30 years ago. Behind them stood 3 others, an elderly man I didn't immediately recognize, a young woman who looked to be in her 20s, and a teenage boy. "May we come in, Sarah?" Mark's voice was gentle, the way it always was when he knew I was frightened. "I know this is a lot, but we don't have much time." I couldn't speak, couldn't nod, couldn't do anything but step aside and watch as 5 dead people walked into my living room like it was the most natural thing in the world. They moved toward the dining room, toward the table I'd set, and I followed like a sleepwalker. The coffee had finished brewing. I found myself pouring cups with steady hands that didn't feel like my own. Serving these impossible guests, my mind completely detached from my body. "You're not real," I finally whispered as I set down the coffee pot. "You're all dead. I buried you. I watched them lower your casket into the ground, Mark. I held Mom's hand when she took her last breath in the hospital. This isn't real." "What is real, sweetheart?" my mother asked, stirring sugar into her coffee. 2 spoons, exactly as she'd always taken it. "This is a breakdown," I said, more to myself than to them. "I'm having a psychotic break. The medication or the stress or—" "Look at me, Sarah." Mark reached across the table, and I recoiled. "I know you're scared, but feel your fear. Really feel it. Does it feel like a dream, or does it feel like the most awake you've been in 3 years? He was right, and I hated that he was right. Everything was too vivid, too detailed. The smell of the coffee, the feel of the chair beneath me, the sound of rain starting up again outside. If this was a hallucination, it was perfect. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Why now?" The elderly man leaned forward. I looked at him more closely and gasped. I did know him. He was the man from the news, the one who'd been found dead in his car near my old neighborhood the week before the fire. His death had been ruled a suicide. "Because you're running out of time, Sarah, and because you deserve to know the truth before you make your choice." "What choice? What are you talking about?"
Ethan appeared then, materializing in the empty 6th chair. "Tell her, Dad. Tell her everything. About the fire. About what really happened." I looked at my husband, at my dead husband, sitting at my table drinking coffee like we were back in our Sunday morning routine. "Mark?" He set down his cup, and I saw his hands were shaking. Even dead, even a ghost or a hallucination or whatever this was, he was nervous. That detail, more than anything, convinced me this was really happening. The fire wasn't an accident, Sarah, Mark said quietly. It was meant for you. It was always meant for you. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table. What? You have to understand. We didn't know. I didn't know. Not until it was too late. Mark's voice cracked. That teaching position you were offered? The one at Riverside Academy? Do you remember? I nodded numbly. Of course I remembered. It had been the opportunity of a lifetime. Department head at a prestigious private school. Triple my salary. I'd been so excited. But then the fire happened, and I'd been in the hospital for 3 months, and by the time I got out... You were going to find out, the young woman spoke up. Her eyes were kind, sad eyes. About the experiments, about what they were doing to the students. What experiments? I don't understand. Riverside Academy, the teenage boy's voice was bitter. It wasn't a school. I mean, it was, but it was also a front for a program, a government program testing things on kids, on us. My mother reached across and took my hand. Her touch was cold but solid, real. You would have discovered it in your first week, baby. The medical tests they were running without parental consent, the drugs, the psychological experiments. You were too good a teacher, too attentive. You would have seen the signs, asked questions. And they couldn't let that happen, Mark continued. So they arranged the fire, made it look like an electrical fault. The investigation ruled it accidental. They made sure of that. They thought they were taking you out. I pulled my hand away from my mother's. No, that's insane. The fire started in Ethan's room. The fire inspector said... The fire inspector was paid off. The elderly man interrupted. I know, because I was the one who was supposed to deliver the payment. But I couldn't do it. Not after I learned there was a child in the house. So I tried to warn you. I left messages on your phone, sent letters, but they got to me before I could reach you directly. I remember now. The strange messages the week before the fire. You were the one. We thought you were a crazy person. We nearly called the police. I wish you had, he said sadly. Maybe things would have been different. But the fire? My mind was reeling. I was supposed to die in the fire? But you did instead. You and Ethan. How does that make sense if I was the target? Mark's face crumpled, and I saw tears on his cheeks. Ghosts crying. Dead men weeping. Because I knew, Sarah. I knew about Riverside. I'd known for months. The world stopped. What? My company. You remember I was doing IT contract work. One of my contracts was with Riverside. I was upgrading their security systems. I saw things, files, video footage. I knew what they were doing to those kids. He couldn't look at me. And I didn't tell you. I was scared. They paid me so much to keep quiet, to make sure their systems were airtight. The money for the new house, the vacation to Disney World, Ethan's private swimming lessons, it all came from them. I stood up so fast my chair clattered backward. You knew? You knew they were hurting children and you said nothing? I was weak, Mark said, and his voice was broken. I told myself it wasn't our problem, that we needed the money, that if I spoke up, we lose everything. And then when you got the job offer, I panicked. I knew once you started, you'd find out and you'd report them, and they'd know I'd told you. So you told them? I said, the pieces clicking into horrible place. No, Mark stood up. No, Sarah, I was trying to get us out. I was planning to move us away, to turn down the offer on your behalf, make it seem like it was my idea. But they were listening. They'd bugged our house. They heard everything. They knew you never agreed to turn down the job. So they decided to eliminate the problem. But they got you instead, the young woman said softly. Because of him. She gestured to the elderly man. Thomas tried to warn you. When the hit team arrived at your house that night, they weren't expecting anyone to be awake. But Thomas's warnings had made Mark paranoid. He was up, watching. He saw them plant the incendiary device in the electrical box. Mark nodded, wiping at his eyes. I heard them in the yard. I went to confront them to try to... I don't know what I thought I could do. But Ethan heard me leave the bedroom. He followed me downstairs. Dad tried to get me to go back to bed. Ethan's small voice cut through. But I saw the bad men, and then everything was on fire. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. Where was I? Why don't I remember any of this? You took those sleeping pills, my mother said gently, the ones you just started taking for your insomnia. You were in deep sleep when the fire started. Mark got me out. I whispered, fragments of memory returning. I remember his arms, but he went back in. For Ethan, Mark finished. He'd run back upstairs, scared. The fire was spreading so fast. I got you to safety, made sure the neighbors were calling 911, and then I went back for our son. Tears were streaming down my face now, and you didn't make it. Either of you. The smoke got us, Ethan said matter-of-factly with a child's simple acceptance of death. It didn't hurt, Mommy. We just went to sleep. I collapsed back into my chair, my mind unable to process everything I was hearing. Why? I asked. Why are you telling me this now? You've been dead for 3 years. Why come back now? The 5 figures exchanged glances. Finally, the teenage boy spoke. Because you're in danger again. They know you've been digging. Digging? I haven't been... The articles you've been reading, my mother interrupted, about Riverside, about the increased security there, the NDAs they make parents sign. You've been researching them, haven't you, baby? I had. God help me, I had. It had started 6 months ago, innocently enough. I'd seen a news story about Riverside Academy winning some educational award. Seeing the name had brought everything back. The job offer I'd never taken, the life I might have had. Out of morbid curiosity, I'd started looking into what the school was like now. And I'd found irregularities. Nothing concrete, but enough to make me curious. Parents who pulled their kids out suddenly and refused to discuss why. A teacher who'd resigned and then vanished. A lawsuit that had been filed and then withdrawn overnight. I was just curious, I said. I wasn't investigating anything. But you were going to, the young woman said. We know you, Sarah. We've been watching. You'd made an appointment to speak with a parent who pulled her daughter out. You'd contacted a journalist. You were doing exactly what they feared 3 years ago. Thomas leaned forward. They're planning another fire, Sarah, for tomorrow night while you sleep. They've learned from their mistakes. This time, they'll make sure.
The casual way he said it, the matter-of-fact tone, made it all the more terrifying. How do you know this? I demanded. How can you possibly know? Because we're the dead, Ethan said simply, and the dead can see things. We can be in places. We can listen to plans, read in rooms that living people think are private. We're not the only ones they've killed, Sarah, the young woman added. I'm Rachel. I was a student at Riverside. I started having seizures from one of their drugs. When my parents threatened to go public, I died in a convenient car accident. Him, she gestured to the teenage boy, is Michael. He tried to run away to tell someone what was happening. They found him 3 days later, ruled it a suicide. There are dozens of us, Michael said, maybe hundreds, all killed to keep Riverside secrets. And we're tired, Sarah. We're so tired of watching them hurt people while we can do nothing. But you can do something, my mother said. You're alive. You have the ability to stop this that we don't. I laughed, a broken, bitter sound. I'm nobody. I'm a traumatized ex-teacher who can barely get out of bed most days. What could I possibly do? Mark reached across the table and took both my hands. His touch was cold, but I didn't pull away this time. You can be what you've always been, he said. You can be brave. You can be smart. You can be the woman who stands up when everyone else sits down, the woman who fights when everyone else gives up, the woman I fell in love with. We have evidence, Thomas said. Before I died, I downloaded files, financial records, experiment logs, videos. I hid them somewhere safe, somewhere only you can access. Why only me? Because I hid them in your mother's grave. I stared at him. You what? I knew they'd never think to look there. I knew Sarah Jenkins, Elizabeth's daughter, would be the last person they'd suspect. I had the files sealed in a waterproof container and buried them in a false flower arrangement 6 months before I died. They've been there ever since, waiting. But we can't tell you what to do with them, Rachel said. This has to be your choice. You can take the files and go public, give them to the journalist you've been in contact with, blow the whole thing wide open. Riverside will be shut down. The people who killed us will face justice. But you'll be in danger, Mark finished. Real danger. Even with the story public, these people have resources. They'll come for you. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Or, I whispered, or you walk away, my mother said gently. You stop researching Riverside. You forget you ever heard of it. You move to another state. Change your name. Start over. Let the dead stay dead and the secret stay buried. Live your life, baby. Find some peace. Maybe even find happiness again. But kids will keep dying, Ethan said quietly. Kids like me. And their parents will hurt like you hurt. And nothing will change. I looked at my son, at my beautiful boy, frozen forever at 8 years old. How long do I have? Until sunrise, Thomas said, glancing toward the window where the sky was definitely lightening. When the sun comes up, we have to go, and we can't come back. This is the one chance, the one night when the veil is thin enough for us to reach you. Whatever you decide, you have to decide now. And if I do nothing? If I don't go to my mother's grave, don't get the files? Then the fire will come tomorrow night, Michael said flatly. And this time, they'll succeed. And everything we've told you, everything we've sacrificed to warn you, will have been for nothing. I stood up, walked to the window. The rain had stopped again. The sky was turning from black to deep blue, the stars fading. Sunrise was maybe 20 minutes away. Behind me, I could feel them watching, waiting. My dead husband, my dead mother, my dead son. And 3 strangers bound to me by tragedy and secrets. Why didn't you tell me before? I asked Mark without turning around. In 3 years, why didn't you find a way to warn me, to tell me the truth? Because I was ashamed. Because I was a coward in life, and death didn't change that. Because I didn't want you to know what I'd done, how I'd failed you both. It took Ethan to convince me. He's braver than I ever was. I turned to look at my son. You did this? You organized this? He nodded. The other kids helped. Rachel showed me how to reach through the veil. Michael taught me how to find the others. And Thomas knew where the evidence was. Grandma, he smiled at my mother. Grandma just came because she knew you'd need her. You always need her when you're scared. My mother smiled, and I saw tears on her face, too. You were my brave girl, even when you were little. Remember when you stood up to those bullies in 4th grade? You came home with a black eye, but you'd protected that smaller boy. You've always protected people, Sarah. It's who you are." "I'm not brave anymore," I whispered. "I'm broken. The fire broke me." "No," Ethan said firmly. "You're sad, but sad isn't the same as broken. You still get up every day. You still try. That's brave, Mommy. That's the bravest thing there is." I looked at each of them in turn. My family, my impossible, dead, beloved family. "If I do this," I said slowly, "if I get the evidence and expose Riverside, I can't protect you. You're already dead. They'll desecrate your graves, destroy your reputations, call you liars. I can only protect myself. And honestly, I'm not sure I can even do that." "We know," Rachel said, "and we're okay with that. We're past being hurt, but the living aren't. The kids currently in Riverside suffering right now, they can still be saved." "Tell me about them," I said. "Tell me about the kids who are there right now." And they did. For the next 15 minutes, as the sky grew lighter and lighter, they told me about Sophie, age 7, who was having her dreams monitored and manipulated, about David, age 13, who was being given drugs to enhance his memory while destroying his personality, about little Emma, only 5 years old, who was being subjected to isolation experiments that would scar her for life. They told me about dozens of children suffering in silence, their parents either complicit or ignorant, while Riverside collected data and government money and called it education. And with each story, I felt something inside me that I thought had died in the fire 3 years ago. I felt anger. Not the helpless, impotent rage I'd felt at the universe for taking my family, but focused, righteous anger, the kind that moves mountains, that changes things, that makes scared people brave. "How much time?" I asked. Thomas glanced at the window. "Maybe 5 minutes, maybe less." I looked at Mark. "If I die doing this, will I see you again?" He smiled, really smiled, for the first time since appearing. "I don't know how it all works, Sarah, but I have to believe that love doesn't end, that we'll find each other again somehow." I looked at my mother. "Do you think I can do this?" "Baby, I've never doubted you for a second." I looked at Ethan, my sweet boy, my brave, impossible boy. "Will you be proud of me?" "I'm already proud of you, Mommy. I've always been proud of you." The sun was kissing the horizon now. The room was filling with that particular golden light that comes just before sunrise. "Then I know what I have to do," I said.
They were already fading. I could see through them now, see the wall behind Mark, the chair through my mother's form. "Wait," I called out. "I haven't told you. I haven't said—" "We know," Ethan said, his voice growing distant, echo-like. "We've always known, and we love you too, Mommy, so much." "Be brave," my mother whispered. "Be smart," Mark added. "Be the light in the darkness," Rachel said. "Make it mean something," Michael urged. "And Sarah," Thomas's voice was the last one, "the container is buried 3 feet down, directly beneath the angel statue at your mother's headstone. And Sarah, run. As soon as you have it, run." And then they were gone. All of them. The room was suddenly warm again, the chill disappearing like it had never been. The coffee cups were empty. The chairs were pushed in neatly as if no one had ever sat there. But I knew better. The coffee pot was half empty. And there, on the table where Ethan had sat, was a small handprint in the condensation from a water glass. I placed my hand over it. His hand had been so much smaller. Then I moved. I threw on clothes, grabbed my car keys, my phone. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. clearer than it had been in 3 years. The cemetery was 15 minutes away. I made it in 10. The gates were locked, but the old stone wall had a section where the mortar had crumbled. I'd played here as a kid, knew every inch of this place. I climbed over, scraping my hands, not caring. My mother's grave was in the old section, beneath a willow tree. The angel statue Thomas mentioned stood guard. Her stone wings spread wide, her face serene. I hadn't visited in months. Grief had kept me away. "I'm sorry, Mom," I whispered as I started digging with my hands at the base of the statue. "I should have come more often. My fingers hit something hard. Not stone, metal. I dug faster, uncovering a waterproof case about the size of a shoebox. It was locked with a combination lock. I stared at it in frustration, then noticed something engraved on the top. The year we met. Mark and I had met in 2003. I spun the numbers. 2003. The lock clicked open. Inside were 3 USB drives, a stack of papers in plastic sleeves, and a handwritten note from Thomas. "If you're reading this, I'm dead, and you're the brave one. These files contain everything. Financial records proving government funding of illegal experiments, video footage of the experiments themselves, testimony from doctors who were threatened into silence. It's enough to bring down not just Riverside, but the entire network of facilities like it across the country. But they will kill you for this, Sarah. They've killed for less. Run, hide, and when you're safe, burn it all down. I'm sorry I couldn't be braver in life. Thomas." I stuffed the case into my bag and started to stand when I heard it. Footsteps, multiple sets, coming fast. "She's at the grave, north section by the willow." They'd followed me. Of course they'd followed me. I'd been so focused on getting the evidence that I hadn't thought about surveillance, about them watching my house, tracking my car. Thomas's last words echoed, "Run." I ran. Through the cemetery, vaulting over old headstones, my bag clutched to my chest. Behind me I heard shouting, the sound of pursuit. The old wall was ahead. I could make it. I had to make it. A hand grabbed my jacket. I twisted, broke free, kept running. My lungs were burning. My heart felt like it might explode. And then I was at the wall. I leapt, caught the top, pulled myself up. Hands grabbed at my feet. I kicked out, connected with something soft. Someone cursed. I tumbled over the wall and landed hard on the other side. Pain shot through my ankle, but I ignored it, limping at first, then running as the adrenaline kicked in. My car was still there. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and peeled out as figures appeared, climbing over the wall behind me. I drove with no destination in mind, taking random turns, watching my rearview mirror. After 20 minutes, I was sure I'd lost them. I pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot and sat there, shaking, trying to think. The journalist. I'd been in contact with Patricia Morrison from the Washington Post. She'd been investigating rumors about Riverside for years. I pulled out my phone and found her number in my contacts. It rang 4 times before a sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Patricia Morrison?" "Yes. Who is this? It's 6 o'clock in the morning." "My name is Sarah Jenkins. We've been in email about Riverside Academy. I have evidence, physical evidence of everything you've been investigating, but I need protection. They tried to kill me. They killed my family 3 years ago, and they're going to try again, and I—" "Slow down." Patricia's voice was suddenly sharp, alert. "Where are you right now?" I told her. "Don't move. I'm 40 minutes away. I'm coming to you, and I'm bringing people, federal people. If what you're saying is true, if you really have evidence—" "I do. Videos, financial records, testimony, it's all here." "Then you just became the most important person in the country and the most endangered. Stay in public. Stay where people can see you. I'm on my way." She hung up. I sat there in my car, clutching the case, watching the sunrise fully over the horizon. Inside the diner, early morning customers were ordering coffee and eggs, living their normal lives, having no idea that in this parking lot, a woman sat holding evidence that would bring down a decades-old conspiracy.
I thought about Mark, about his cowardice, about how he'd taken their money and stayed silent while children suffered. I understood it, in a way. Fear is powerful. The need to provide for your family is powerful. It's easy to tell yourself that you're just one person, that you can't change anything, that keeping your head down is the smart choice. But it's not the brave choice. And I was done being afraid. I'd lost everything already. My husband, my son, my career, my life. What more could they take from me? My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We know where you are. Last chance. Leave the case in the parking lot and walk away. We'll let you live. You have 5 minutes." I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I got out of the car, walked into the diner, and approached the counter. "Can I help you?" the waitress asked. "I need you to call 911, I said. "Tell them there's about to be a situation at this location and to send every available unit. Then I need you to get everyone away from the windows." She stared at me. "Ma'am, are you—" "Please, trust me. Lives depend on it." Something in my face must have convinced her. She picked up the phone. I walked back outside. The parking lot was still quiet, but I could see a black SUV slowly approaching from the north. Another from the south. They were boxing me in. I stood in the middle of the parking lot, the case at my feet, and I waited. The SUV stopped. Doors opened. 4 men emerged, all wearing suits, all with that blank professional expression of people who do terrible things for a living. "Mrs. Jenkins," one of them called out, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." "I don't think I am. I think I'm making it exactly as hard as it needs to be." "We don't want to hurt you." "Yes, you do. You've wanted to hurt me for 3 years. You just haven't had the chance." I stood up straighter. "But here's what you didn't count on. I've already sent copies of everything in this case to 5 different journalists. It's already out there. You can kill me, but you can't stop what's coming." It was a bluff, but it was a good bluff. The men looked at each other, uncertain for the first time. And then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. Multiple sirens coming from multiple directions. The men heard them too. One of them reached into his jacket, and I thought, this is it. This is where I die. But then a voice cut through the morning air. "Federal agents! Hands where I can see them!" Patricia Morrison hadn't just called the police. She'd called the FBI. What happened next was a blur. The men being surrounded, arrested, me being hustled into a protective vehicle. Questions, so many questions. The case being taken into evidence, statements being recorded. It would be 3 days before I'd sleep in a bed. 2 weeks before the story broke nationally. A month before the first arrests of high-level government officials. And 3 months before I'd stand before a Senate committee and tell the whole truth about Riverside Academy and the network of facilities like it that had been operating in the shadows for decades. But all of that was later. In that moment, in the back of that FBI vehicle, I thought about my family. About Mark's redemption through his final act of trying to save Ethan. About my mother's unwavering faith in me. About Ethan's bravery, organizing the dead to save the living. And about the choice I had made.
The courtroom was packed for the sentencing hearing. I sat in the front row, watching as the men and women who'd orchestrated the Riverside program were led in one by one. 12 defendants. Charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder, illegal human experimentation, fraud, and 24 other crimes. Patricia Morrison sat beside me, her hand on my shoulder. She'd won a Pulitzer for the story. But more importantly, she'd saved my life. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded. I was more than okay. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. The program had been shut down. 147 children had been removed from Riverside and similar facilities and were receiving proper medical care and counseling. Parents who'd been complicit had been arrested. Those who'd been deceived were getting justice. And the dead, well, they were at rest now. I hoped. I believed. I'd visited my mother's grave the week before, brought flowers, sat and talked to her for hours like I used to do when I was young and confused and needed guidance. I'd visited Mark and Ethan's graves too, told them about the trial, about the children being saved, about all of it. And maybe it was just the wind or my imagination or grief playing tricks. But I swear I felt a small hand slip into mine, heard a voice whisper, "We're proud of you, Mommy." The judge was reading the sentences now. Life in prison, no possibility of parole, for all of them. It wouldn't bring back the dead, wouldn't undo the damage done to so many children. But it was something. It was justice. After the hearing, I walked out into the autumn afternoon. The leaves were turning gold and red and orange. The air smelled like rain coming. A year ago, I would have gone home to my empty house and my sleeping pills and my grief. But I wasn't that person anymore. I'd been offered my job back, department head at a different school, one that actually cared about children. I accepted. I was starting next week. I'd also started writing a book about everything that had happened, about the power of choosing courage over comfort, of speaking up when staying silent would be easier, about the night the dead came to call, and how they taught me to live again. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Thank you." Just those 2 words, but somehow I knew it was from one of the parents whose child had been saved, one of the dozens who'd reached out over the months, sharing their stories, their gratitude. I text back, "Thank you for being brave enough to believe me." I drove home through the beautiful autumn afternoon, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't dread walking into my house because it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of purpose, full of meaning, full of the knowledge that I'd done something that mattered. That night, I made coffee before bed, not because I planned to drink it, but because the smell reminded me of Sunday mornings, of family, of love that doesn't end just because people die. I poured a cup and set it on the counter. "This is for you, Mark, and you, Mom, and you, Ethan, and for Thomas and Rachel and Michael and all the others." The coffee sat there, steam rising in the quiet kitchen. And maybe I imagined it or maybe I didn't, but I swear the steam formed shapes, familiar shapes. A man, a woman, a child, my family, together again for just a moment. And then the steam dispersed and they were gone, and I was alone, but not lonely. Never lonely again. Because I learned the truth that night, 6 months ago, when the dead came to call. Love doesn't end. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. And sometimes, The most important thing you can do is make coffee and set the table, because you never know who might need a seat at your table, who might need to be heard, who might need you to be brave when everyone else chooses to be silent. I turned off the lights and went to bed, and for the first time in 3 years, I slept without pills, without nightmares. I slept peacefully because the dead were finally at rest, and I was finally, truly alive.